The snow fell in relentless sheets as Catherine Darby stumbled through the deepening drifts, her thin shawl offering little protection against the merciless Nebraska winter of 1875. Her family's final words still rang in her ears, sharp as the icy wind cutting through her sodden clothes. "You've disgraced us for the last time." Catherine's fingers had long since gone numb, her breath coming in ragged clouds before her face as she forced herself forward. The blizzard had descended without warning, transforming the familiar landscape of Nebraska City into a treacherous white void. She had been walking for what felt like hours, having no destination in mind after her father had thrown her belongings onto the porch and locked the door behind her. The lantern she carried cast feeble light through the swirling snow, barely illuminating a few feet ahead. Catherine had no idea where she was going, only that she couldn't go back, not to that house of judgment and condemnation. Not to the family that had turned their backs on her for refusing to marry the wealthy banker. Her father had chosen a man 3 times her age with wandering hands and cruel eyes. When the silhouette of a gate loomed through the blizzard, Catherine nearly wept with relief. Beyond it stood a modest cabin, a thin trail of smoke rising from its chimney. Light glowed in a single window, promising warmth and shelter if its owner proved merciful. Her strength finally failing, Catherine's frozen fingers fumbled with the gate latch. She managed to push it open just as her legs gave way beneath her, sending her collapsing against the rough wooden posts. The lantern slipped from her grasp, extinguishing in the snow with a soft hiss. Ethan Dawson was stoking his fireplace when he heard the rattle of his front gate. No one in their right mind would be traveling in such weather. He grabbed his rifle and peered through the frosted window, startled to see a figure slumped against his gate, half buried in rapidly accumulating snow. He yanked open his door, the wind nearly tearing it from his grasp as he struggled through the drifts. When he reached the gate, his heart stopped at the sight of a young woman, her lips blue, golden hair crusted with ice and body shaking uncontrollably. Miss. Ethan shouted over the howling wind, lifting her frozen form into his arms. "Hold on, just hold on." She weighed almost nothing as he carried her through the blizzard and into his cabin. The warmth of the fire seemed to bring her back to consciousness, her eyelids fluttering to reveal eyes as blue as a summer sky. "Thank you," she whispered through chattering teeth, before succumbing once more to the darkness. Ethan worked quickly, wrapping her in every blanket he owned and positioning her near the fire. He rubbed her hands and feet, knowing the dangers of frostbite all too well. Once her shivering had subsided somewhat, he prepared a hot drink, adding a splash of whiskey for good measure. "Can you sit up?" he asked gently when she stirred again. "You need to drink this." Catherine nodded weakly, allowing him to help her into a seated position. The warm liquid burned her throat but spread much-needed heat through her body. "I'm Catherine," she managed after a few cautious sips. "Catherine Darby, Ethan Dawson," he replied, his voice deep and steady. "What in God's name were you doing out in this storm, Miss Darby?" Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "My family, they locked me out. I refused to marry the man my father chose." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had heard of such arrangements, though they seemed more fitting for the old country than the American frontier. His own parents had taught him that marriage should be a choice made from love, not obligation. "You're safe here," he assured her, adding another log to the fire. "Rest now. We'll figure things out when the storm passes." Catherine studied her rescuer as he moved about the cabin. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt. His face was weathered from years under the sun, but his eyes were kind. Not the eyes of someone who would take advantage of her vulnerable position. "Are you a cowboy, Mr. Dawson?" she asked, noticing the worn leather chaps hanging by the door and spurs beside his boots. He smiled slightly. "I run cattle on the North Pasture. Not as many as I'd like, but it's an honest living." "I've never met a real cowboy before," Catherine admitted, feeling warmth return to her limbs and a different kind of warmth spreading in her chest as she watched him work. "Well, I'm nothing special," Ethan replied, stirring a pot of stew he'd placed over the fire. Just trying to make my way like everyone else." As the night deepened and the storm raged outside, Catherine found herself sharing more than she had intended. She told Ethan about her family's expectations, her father's banking business, and the suffocating life that had been planned for her without her consent. "I've always wanted more," she confessed. "I want to see places, do things that matter. Is that so terrible?" Ethan shook his head. "Not terrible at all. That's the promise of the West, isn't it? A chance to build something of your own." Catherine smiled weakly. "That's what I thought too, but it seems women aren't afforded the same opportunities." "Maybe not traditionally," Ethan agreed, "but things are changing." "Slowly, but they're changing." As Catherine finally drifted to sleep, wrapped in Ethan's blankets and warmed by his fire, he sat watching the flames and wondering what twist of fate had brought this determined young woman to his doorstep and what the morning would bring. The blizzard raged for 3 days. During that time, Catherine recovered her strength and learned more about the quiet cowboy who had saved her life. Ethan had come to Nebraska 5 years earlier, purchasing a modest plot of land and slowly building his herd. He lived simply but purposefully, rising before dawn to tend his cattle and working until sunset. "You never get lonely out here?" Catherine asked on the second evening as they shared a meal of venison stew. Ethan considered the question. "Sometimes, but I've got my horses, my cattle." "The occasional visitor." He smiled at her across the table. "Present company being the most interesting in quite some time." Catherine blushed, realizing how improper their situation would appear to her family. A young, unmarried woman staying unchaperoned in a man's home would be cause for scandal, yet another reason they would claim to have been justified in casting her out. "I should find somewhere else to go once the storm passes," she said reluctantly. Ethan's brow furrowed. "Where would you go?" "I don't know," Catherine admitted. "I have an aunt in Kansas City, but I'm not sure she would take me in against my father's wishes." "No need to rush," Ethan said, more quickly than he had intended. "Winter's just beginning. The roads will be impassable for weeks yet." Catherine felt a flutter in her stomach at his words. Did he want her to stay? Or was he merely being practical? On the morning of the 4th day, the storm finally subsided, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white drifts and crystal-clear skies. Ethan ventured out to check on his cattle, finding most had survived by huddling together in the lee of a natural rock formation. When he returned, stamping snow from his boots, he found Catherine standing uncertainly in the middle of the cabin. "I need to earn my keep," she declared. "I can cook, clean, mend. I won't be a burden while I'm here." Ethan's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "If you're staying, we're partners, not master and servant." "Partners?" Catherine repeated, the word unfamiliar on her tongue when spoken between a man and woman. "That's right," Ethan said, hanging his coat by the door. "I could use the help and you need shelter. Seems fair to me." And so began their tentative arrangement. Catherine proved to be a quick study in the tasks of frontier life. She learned to milk the cow Ethan kept for fresh dairy, to chop kindling without catching her skirts, and to identify which plants in his small winter garden were ready for harvest. In turn, Ethan found himself rising each morning with an unfamiliar sense of anticipation. The cabin, which had always been merely a place to sleep and eat between work, now felt like a home. The sight of Catherine humming as she kneaded bread or mended his shirts by the fire brought a warmth to his chest that had nothing to do with the flames. As January turned to February, they fell into a comfortable routine. During the days, they worked side by side when weather permitted. In the evenings, they would read from Ethan's small collection of books or simply talk, learning each other's histories and dreams. "I never meant to stay in Nebraska City this long," Ethan confessed one night. "I was heading to California, thought I'd try my luck in the gold country." "What made you stay?" Catherine asked, looking up from her mending. Ethan shrugged. "Found this land for a good price. Realized I preferred cattle to gold panning. The roots just grew, I suppose. Do you regret it, not continuing west?" He looked at her thoughtfully, the firelight playing across her features. "Not recently, no." Catherine's cheeks flushed, and she returned her attention to her sewing. Their peaceful existence was interrupted one crisp February morning by the arrival of riders. Catherine was hanging laundry to dry in the winter sun when she spotted 3 men approaching on horseback. Her heart hammered in her chest as she recognized her brother Benjamin at the lead. Ethan. She called urgently, dropping the wet clothes and rushing toward the barn where he was mending tack. He emerged immediately, sensing the alarm in her voice. When she pointed to the approaching riders, his expression hardened. "Stay behind me," he said quietly, retrieving his rifle from where it leaned against the barn wall. Benjamin Darby reined his horse to a stop several yards from where Ethan and Catherine stood. His companions, one Catherine recognized as her father's clerk, the other a stranger, flanked him with hands resting too casually near their holstered pistols. "Catherine," Benjamin called, ignoring Ethan completely. "Father sent me to bring you home. This foolishness has gone on long enough." Catherine stepped forward, though she remained at Ethan's side. "I'm not coming back, Ben, not to be sold off like cattle. You've been living with this." Benjamin's gaze flicked dismissively to Ethan. "Cowhand for nearly 2 months. Your reputation is already in tatters." "My reputation?" Catherine laughed bitterly. "The same reputation Father was willing to sacrifice by marrying me to a man who's buried 2 wives already." Benjamin's jaw clenched. "Jasper Norton is a respected businessman. Father has already signed the marriage contract. You have no choice in this matter." Ethan spoke then, his voice dangerously calm. "The lady has made her choice clear. I suggest you respect it. And who are you to interfere in family matters?" Benjamin sneered. "Some saddled tramp who thinks he can keep my sister as his. That's enough." Catherine interrupted, stepping fully in front of Ethan now. "I am not going back, not today, not ever. Tell Father he has no daughter if these are his terms." The clerk reached for his gun, but Ethan was faster, raising his rifle to shoulder height. "I wouldn't," he warned. "Not if you want to ride out of here." A tense silence followed, broken only by the nervous shuffling of horses. Finally, Benjamin nodded to his companions. "This isn't finished, Catherine," he called as they turned their horses. "When you come to your senses, pray it's not too late." They watched the riders disappear over the rise, Catherine's heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. When they were truly gone, she turned to Ethan, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I've brought trouble to your door." Ethan lowered his rifle, his expression softening as he looked at her. "You've brought a lot of things to my door, Catherine Darby. Trouble's the least of them." Before she could respond, he had pulled her into his arms, holding her as she sobbed against his chest. He stroked her hair, murmuring reassurances that felt like promises against her ear. "They'll be back," Catherine said when she had calmed enough to speak. "My father doesn't give up easily, especially when money is involved." Ethan nodded grimly. "Then we'd best be prepared." Over the next week, they fortified the property as best they could. Ethan taught Catherine to shoot his spare revolver, a task she approached with grim determination. They established signals and plans for various scenarios, uncertain what form her family's next attempt might take. What neither expected was the letter that arrived with the mail carrier who made his monthly rounds to the outlying farms. It was addressed to Catherine, the elegant script unmistakably her mother's. She read it in silence, her face growing paler with each line. When she finished, she handed it wordlessly to Ethan. The letter outlined the consequences of Catherine's shameful behavior. Her father had disowned her publicly, spreading word that she had run off with a common cowhand. The banker, Norton, had withdrawn his offer of marriage, citing her questionable virtue. Most devastating of all, her mother wrote that unless Catherine returned immediately, repentant and willing to accept whatever penance her father demanded, she would no longer be acknowledged as part of the family. "I'm sorry," Ethan said softly, returning the letter. Catherine stared at the paper, then suddenly tossed it into the fire, watching as the flames consumed her mother's words. "They were never going to accept my choices," she said, her voice stronger than Ethan expected. "At least now I know where I stand." That night, as a gentle snow began to fall outside, Catherine found herself unable to sleep on the small pallet Ethan had arranged for her near the fireplace. She rose, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, and moved to the window to watch the snowflakes dance in the moonlight. Can't sleep." Ethan's voice came softly from the darkness. Catherine turned to find him sitting up in his bed across the room. "Too much on my mind," she admitted. He nodded, understanding without her having to explain. "Come sit," he offered, patting the edge of his bed. She hesitated only briefly before joining him. They sat side by side in comfortable silence, watching the snow through the window. "What will you do now?" Ethan finally asked. "With your family's decision made clear," Catherine considered the question. "I don't know. I have some education perhaps I could teach, or work as a seamstress." She glanced at him uncertainly. "I should probably move on to another town once spring comes." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "You could stay," he said finally, his voice low, "if you wanted to, as your housekeeper." Catherine asked, heart racing. "No." Ethan turned to face her fully. "As whatever you want to be, my partner, he faltered, then gathered his courage. "Catherine, I know it hasn't been long, but these weeks with you have been the happiest of my life. I never thought I'd find someone who fits so perfectly here with me with this life." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. "Ethan, I'm not offering out of pity or duty," he continued earnestly. "I'm offering because I've fallen in love with you. Your strength, your determination, your kindness. If you need more time or if your feelings don't match mine, I understand, but I wanted you to know you have a place here always." Catherine reached out, placing her hand against his cheek. "I've fallen in love with you too," she whispered. "I think I started falling that first night when you carried me through the snow." Ethan covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss against her palm. "Then stay, build a life with me." "Yes," Catherine answered without hesitation. "Yes, I'll stay." Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long winter. When they parted, both were smiling, the weight of uncertainty finally lifted from their shoulders. Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers and new possibilities. Ethan and Catherine were married by a traveling preacher who stopped at their ranch on his circuit. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, witnessed by a handful of Ethan's neighboring ranchers and their wives, who had welcomed Catherine warmly into their small community. Life settled into a new rhythm, different from the one they had established during those winter months, but no less harmonious. Catherine planted a larger garden, determined to preserve enough food for the coming winter. Ethan expanded his herd, purchasing additional cattle from a rancher heading east. They were working together to repair a section of fence when they spotted a cloud of dust approaching from the direction of town. Catherine shaded her eyes, trying to identify the rider. "It's Sheriff Miller," Ethan said, recognizing the man's distinctive hat. "Wonder what brings him all the way out here." The sheriff reined in his horse and dismounted, tipping his hat to Catherine. "Mrs. Dawson," he acknowledged, still getting used to her new name. "Ethan." "What can we do for you, Sheriff?" Ethan asked, setting down his hammer. Sheriff Miller's expression was grave. "Got some news you should hear. There's been talk in town about some men asking questions about your place, 3 of them led by a fella named Darby." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. "My brother, seems likely," the sheriff confirmed. "They've been drinking heavily at the saloon, making some threats. Thought you should know." "Thank you for the warning," Ethan said, his arm instinctively going around Catherine's shoulders. After the sheriff departed, promising to keep an eye on the situation, Catherine and Ethan returned to the cabin to discuss their options. "We could leave," Catherine suggested, though the thought of abandoning the home they had built together pained her. "Start fresh somewhere else." Ethan shook his head firmly. "This is our home. Your family doesn't get to chase us from it." "They won't give up easily," Catherine warned. "Benjamin especially. He's always done Father's bidding without question." "Then we'll face them together," Ethan said, taking her hands in his. "Like we've faced everything else." They didn't have long to wait. The following afternoon, as Catherine was gathering eggs from the henhouse, she heard horses approaching. Peering through the slats, she saw Benjamin and 4 men she didn't recognize riding toward the cabin. Catherine ran to where Ethan was repairing a saddle in the barn. "They're here," she gasped. "Benjamin and others strangers." Ethan immediately stood, checking that his revolver was loaded. "Get inside the cabin," he instructed. "Use the rifle if you need to, but stay out of sight if possible." Catherine nodded, her mouth dry with fear. They had prepared for this, but the reality was far more terrifying than the anticipation had been. Benjamin and his companions halted their horses in the yard, forming a semicircle facing the cabin. Ethan emerged from the barn, walking with deliberate calm toward them. "That's far enough, Dawson," Benjamin called. "We've come for my sister." "Your sister is my wife now," Ethan replied evenly. "And she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." One of the strangers spat on the ground. "Heard you stole her away in the night, seduced her from her family." "That's a lie," Ethan said, his hand resting near his holster. "She came here seeking shelter when her family cast her out in a blizzard, would have died if I hadn't found her." Benjamin's face darkened with anger. "Another lie." Catherine has always been prone to dramatics and exaggeration. From inside the cabin, Catherine watched through a window, the rifle steady in her hands. When Benjamin dismounted and took a threatening step toward Ethan, she knew she couldn't remain hidden. The cabin door opened and Catherine stepped onto the porch, rifle raised but not aimed directly at the men. "That's enough, Benjamin," she called, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wasn't kidnapped or seduced. I chose to leave rather than be sold to the highest bidder." Benjamin turned toward her, his expression a mixture of anger and relief at seeing her alive. "Catherine, father is dying," he said, his voice dropping. "His heart is failing. Come home, make your peace before it's too late." Catherine faltered, the rifle lowering slightly. "Dying, is that true?" "Would I lie about such a thing?" Benjamin demanded. "He had an attack after you left. The doctor says he won't last the month." Ethan watched Catherine closely, seeing the conflict in her eyes. "If you want to go to him, I'll take you," he offered quietly, "but I won't let you go alone with them." Catherine's gaze shifted between her husband and her brother. "If father truly is dying, I should see him," she said finally. "But I'll return with my husband afterward. That's non-negotiable." Benjamin's jaw worked as he considered her terms. "Fine," he conceded reluctantly, "but we leave now." "We'll need time to prepare," Ethan countered. "We'll ride to town tomorrow morning." After a tense negotiation, Benjamin agreed to return to town and meet them the following day. As the riders departed, Catherine leaned heavily against Ethan, suddenly exhausted. "Do you think he's telling the truth?" she asked. "About father," Ethan stroked her hair gently. "I don't know, but we'll find out together." They spent the evening preparing for the journey to Nebraska City, unsure what awaited them there. Catherine packed her few belongings, including the wedding band. Ethan had given her a simple gold ring that meant more to her than all the jewelry her father had once offered. "Whatever happens," Ethan promised as they lay together that night, "we face it as one." Morning dawned clear and bright, belying the apprehension they both felt. They rode to town in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Sheriff Miller was waiting at the appointed meeting place, having insisted on accompanying them as a precaution. Benjamin appeared with only one companion, this time the family's carriage driver. "The others returned to their own business," he explained, though Catherine suspected the sheriff's presence had more to do with their absence. The journey to Nebraska City took most of the day, the roads still muddy from spring thaws. As they approached the town's outskirts, Catherine felt a strange mixture of familiarity and alienation. This had been her home for 23 years, yet in just a few months, it had become foreign territory. The Darby mansion stood as imposingly as ever on the hill overlooking the town. As their small party approached the wrought iron gates, Catherine's hand sought Ethan's, drawing strength from his steady presence. To her surprise, it was her mother who met them at the door, her usually perfect appearance somewhat disheveled, dark circles beneath her eyes suggesting many sleepless nights. "Catherine," Eleanor Darby breathed, reaching for her daughter before remembering herself and withdrawing her hands. "You came, is it true?" Catherine asked without preamble. "Is father dying?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, the doctor says it could be any day now," Catherine nodded, steeling herself. "This is my husband, Ethan Dawson. Where I go, he goes." Her mother's gaze flicked to Ethan, taking in his simple but clean attire, his weathered face, the way he stood protectively close to Catherine. Something in Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "Very well," she said after a moment. Your father is in his study." He refused to take to his bed, stubborn as always. They followed Alina through the grand foyer, past the formal parlor where Catherine had endured countless uncomfortable tea parties and suitors' visits. The house felt smaller somehow, less intimidating than it had in her memory. Henry Darby sat behind his massive oak desk, looking significantly frailer than when Catherine had last seen him. His skin had a grayish pallor, and his once robust frame seemed to have collapsed in on itself. He looked up as they entered, his eyes widening at the sight of his daughter. "So you came," he said, his voice weaker than Catherine remembered but still carrying that note of authority that had defined her childhood. "Benjamin said you were ill," Catherine replied, remaining near the doorway with Ethan at her side. Henry's gaze shifted to Ethan, hardening. "And you brought him, he couldn't bring himself to say the word husband." "My husband," Catherine confirmed, lifting her chin slightly. "Ethan Dawson." A tense silence filled the room. Alina hovered uncertainly near her husband while Benjamin stood rigidly by the window. It was Sheriff Miller who broke the impasse. "I'll wait outside," he said, tipping his hat before withdrawing. Once the door closed behind him, Henry spoke again. "I suppose you've come to gloat, to watch the old man die knowing his daughter defied him to the end." "No," Catherine said softly. "I came because, despite everything, you're still my father." Something flickered in Henry's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or a grudging respect. He gestured weakly to the chairs across from his desk. "Sit then, both of you." As Catherine and Ethan took their seats, Alina excused herself, murmuring something about tea. Benjamin remained at his post by the window, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. "So," Henry said, studying Ethan with undisguised skepticism, "you're the man who took my daughter." "With respect, sir," Ethan replied evenly, "I didn't take her. I found her half frozen at my gate after she was locked out in a blizzard." Henry's gaze shifted to Catherine. "Is this true?" "Yes," she answered simply. "After I refused to marry Jasper Norton, you told me I was no longer welcome in this house. Mother packed my things while you and Benjamin watched. Then you locked the door behind me as the storm was building." Henry had the grace to look momentarily discomfited. "It was meant as a lesson," he said gruffly. "We expected you'd come to your senses before the storm worsened. When you didn't return." He trailed off. "When I didn't return, you disowned me publicly," Catherine finished for him. "Spread rumors about me running off with a man." "What were we supposed to think?" Benjamin interjected. "You disappeared for months. You could have looked for me," Catherine countered, hurt evident in her voice. "Sent someone to make sure I was safe." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Henry shifted in his chair, wincing slightly as if in pain. "Your mother was distraught," he said finally. "Wouldn't speak to me for weeks, said I'd driven you away with my stubbornness." He laughed humorlessly. "Seems she was right." Catherine hadn't expected anything resembling an admission of fault from her father. The surprise must have shown on her face, for Henry continued in a softer tone. "Facing death has a way of clarifying things, Catherine. I've built everything in my life, this house, the bank, our family's position through force of will and refusing to bend, but I can't bully death into submission." He coughed, a rattling sound that confirmed the gravity of his condition. "And I couldn't bend you to my will either." Perhaps that should have made me proud rather than angry. Catherine felt tears pricking at her eyes. This wasn't the reunion she had anticipated, not the continued condemnation she had steeled herself against, nor the dramatic deathbed reconciliation of storybooks. Instead, it was something messier, more human. "I didn't leave to hurt you," she said quietly. "I left because I needed to live my own life, make my own choices." Henry nodded slowly. "And this man," he gestured to Ethan, "he was your choice?" "Yes," Catherine answered without hesitation. "We built a life together, a good one, different from what you wanted for me, but it's mine." For a long moment, Henry simply looked between them, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Benjamin. "Leave us. I need to speak with your sister and her." He hesitated, then conceded. "Her husband alone." Benjamin protested, but a sharp look from his father silenced him. Once he had left, closing the door with unnecessary force, Henry leaned forward on his desk. "I'm not a man who admits mistakes easily," he began. But I was wrong to try to force that marriage on you. Norton showed his true colors after you left, drank heavily, made inappropriate advances toward the Miller girl. You were right about him. Catherine couldn't hide her shock at this admission. Father, let me finish, Henry interrupted. I'm still not happy with how things turned out. I had plans for you, Catherine, plans for the family, for the business, but I'd rather have a daughter who defied me than no daughter at all. He turned to Ethan. And I suppose if she had to choose someone, at least it was a man with enough backbone to stand up to Benjamin and his hired guns. Ethan inclined his head slightly, accepting the backhanded compliment for what it was. I love your daughter, Mr. Darby. I'll spend my life making sure she never regrets choosing me. Henry studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once decisively. See that you do. He shifted his attention back to Catherine. Now, tell me about this life you've built. Is it truly what you want? For the next hour, Catherine described their small ranch, their plans for expansion, the community they had become part of. As she spoke, she realized how much she had come to love the life she and Ethan shared, not despite its simplicity, but because of it. There was an honesty to their existence that had always been lacking in the carefully orchestrated world of her childhood. Henry listened more attentively than he ever had before, occasionally asking questions that suggested genuine interest rather than criticism. By the time Alina returned with tea, the atmosphere in the study had transformed from hostile standoff to cautious rapprochement. Will you stay the night? Alina asked hopefully as she poured the tea. Catherine glanced at Ethan, who nodded his agreement. Yes, but just tonight. We need to return to the ranch tomorrow. That evening, as Catherine showed Ethan around the gardens where she had played as a child, she felt a sense of closure beginning to form. The Darby mansion would never be her home again, but perhaps it didn't need to represent only painful memories either. Your father is a complicated man, Ethan observed as they walked among the budding roses. Catherine smiled ruefully. That's a diplomatic way of putting it, but yes, he is. I think today is the first time I've ever really felt like he saw me as a person, not just an extension of himself. Sometimes it takes nearly losing something to recognize its true value, Ethan said, pulling her close as the evening air grew cool. They retired to the guest room. Alina had prepared for them a concession that would have been unthinkable months before. As they lay together in the unfamiliar bed, Catherine whispered, "Thank you for coming with me, for understanding why I needed to do this." Ethan kissed her gently. "We're partners, remember? Your battles are mine too." The following morning brought news that surprised them both. Henry asked to speak with them privately once more before their departure. "I've been thinking," he began without preamble when they were seated in his study. "The Wilkins property adjacent to your ranch, it's in foreclosure. The bank holds the note." Catherine tensed, unsure where her father was heading with this. "Yes, poor Mr. Wilkins. His wife's illness took everything they had," Henry nodded. "The property will go to auction next month. Good land, from what I understand. Additional water access, fertile soil." He opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a document. "I've instructed the bank to transfer ownership to both of you as a wedding present." Catherine stared at her father in disbelief. "But that land must be worth a considerable sum." "Yes," Henry finished for her. "Consider it my investment in your future." He slid the document across the desk. "The deed will be officially recorded once the necessary paperwork is processed." Ethan studied the older man carefully. "That's very generous, sir. May I ask why?" Henry's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile. "Call it a peace offering or a grandfather's legacy, perhaps." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. "How did you know?" "Your mother noticed immediately," Henry replied, his expression softening. "The way you've been resting your hand on your stomach, the slight fullness to your face. She had the same signs with each of you children." Ethan turned to Catherine in amazement. "Is it true?" She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I was going to tell you when we returned home. I wanted to be certain first." Ethan gathered her in his arms, heedless of her father's presence, his face alight with joy. "A child," he whispered in wonder. "Our child." Henry cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the display of emotion but making an effort to hide his discomfort. "Well then, all the more reason to secure your future. That land will give you room to expand your operation, provide for your family. Thank you, Father, Catherine said sincerely. This means more than you know. They departed later that morning, promises made to write regularly and perhaps visit again in the autumn. As they rode away from Nebraska City, Catherine felt lighter than she had in months, as if a burden she hadn't fully acknowledged had been lifted from her shoulders. Are you happy? Ethan asked as they crested the hill that would take them out of sight of the town. Catherine turned to him, the spring sun warming her face and the future stretching before them like an open road. Happier than I ever dreamed possible, she answered truthfully. The journey back to their ranch passed quickly, filled with plans and dreams for their expanding family and land. By the time they arrived home, Catherine felt as if she had been away for months rather than days. Sheriff Miller, true to his word, had arranged for a neighbor to check on their livestock during their absence. Everything was as they had left it, yet Catherine saw their small cabin with new eyes, not comparing it unfavorably to her father's mansion, but appreciating it as the heart of the life she and Ethan were building. That night, as they lay together in their own bed, Ethan placed his hand gently over Catherine's still flat stomach. A baby, he marveled. I never thought I'd have a family of my own. Are you pleased? Catherine asked, watching his face in the lamplight. Pleased doesn't begin to describe it, Ethan answered, drawing her close. Terrified, excited, grateful, all of those at once, Catherine laughed softly. That matches my feelings exactly. As spring gave way to summer, Catherine's condition became more apparent. The neighboring ranchers' wives proved to be a treasure trove of advice and support, bringing gifts of baby clothes and sharing wisdom passed down through generations of frontier women. Work on expanding their property began in earnest. With the additional land from Catherine's father, Ethan was able to increase his herd substantially. They hired 2 young cowboys to help with the cattle, building a bunkhouse for them at the edge of the property. Catherine, despite her growing belly, insisted on remaining active in ranch operations. She established a larger garden, began keeping bees for honey, and even learned to help with the branding of new calves, though Ethan drew the line at allowing her near the more unpredictable animals as her pregnancy progressed. In late August, Henry Darby passed away peacefully in his sleep. The letter from Alina arrived a week after the funeral. Catherine mourned the father she had only begun to truly know, finding comfort in the knowledge that they had made their peace before the end. To her surprise, Benjamin came to visit in early September, riding up to the ranch alone on a fine bay horse. His relationship with Catherine remained strained, but he made a visible effort to be civil to Ethan and showed genuine interest in the improvements they had made to the property. Father left instructions in his will, Benjamin explained over dinner in their cabin. Half of his personal fortune is to be held in trust for your child and any others that may follow. Catherine nearly dropped the plate she was holding. What? But I thought that he'd disinherit you completely, Benjamin finished with a wry smile. So did I, to be honest, but it seems his change of heart was genuine. He hesitated, then added, Mother is considering moving to St. Louis to be near Aunt Margaret. This house, it holds too many memories now. She's welcome here, Catherine said impulsively. Anytime she wishes to visit. Benjamin nodded, though they both knew Alina Darby would find the rustic ranch a far cry from the comfort she was accustomed to. Still, the invitation was sincere, and Catherine hoped her mother might someday accept it. As autumn painted the prairie in golds and reds, Catherine's time drew near. Ethan arranged for Mrs. Peterson, a neighbor with experience as a midwife, to stay with them during the final weeks of her pregnancy. The baby arrived on a crisp October morning after a labor that lasted through the night. Ethan paced anxiously outside the bedroom door, driven out by Mrs. Peterson when his hovering became too distracting. When he finally heard the thin, indignant cry of his child, he nearly broke the door in his haste to enter. Catherine lay exhausted but radiant against the pillows, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. Come meet your son, she whispered as Ethan approached the bed. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a surprising amount of dark hair that promised to match his father's. As Ethan gently took his son in his arms, he felt a love so overwhelming it brought tears to his eyes. "Henry," he said softly, "Henry Ethan Dawson." Catherine smiled, touched by his choice to honor her father. "It's perfect." Mrs. Peterson bustled around, cleaning up and preparing a restorative tea for Catherine. "Strong boy," she pronounced approvingly. "Good lungs on him, he'll do well." The following weeks were a blur of adjustment as they learned to navigate life with a newborn. Henry proved to be a good-natured baby, sleeping for decent stretches and eating vigorously. Catherine recovered quickly from the birth, though she found herself appreciating the help of the neighboring women who took turns bringing meals and offering assistance. Ethan took to fatherhood with a natural ease that surprised them both. He would walk with Henry in the evenings, pointing out stars and cattle and telling the infant about all the things they would do together as he grew. Winter arrived with a gentleness that belied the previous year's ferocity. Snow fell in light dustings rather than blinding storms, and the temperature remained mild enough for daily activities to continue without much disruption. As Christmas approached, they received an unexpected letter. Eleanor Darby announced her intention to visit before continuing on to St. Louis, where she had indeed decided to relocate. Catherine spent days preparing for her mother's arrival, suddenly seeing their comfortable home through Eleanor's critical eyes. "Stop worrying," Ethan told her as she fretted over the simplicity of their furnishings. "This is our home, not a showpiece. Your mother will have to accept us as we are." Eleanor arrived in a hired carriage, accompanied by more trunks than seemed reasonable for a short visit. Her initial reaction to the ranch was carefully neutral, though Catherine caught the slight widening of her eyes as she took in the modest cabin and surrounding outbuildings. Any reservations Eleanor might have harbored, however, disappeared the moment she held her grandson. "Oh," she breathed as Henry regarded her with solemn dark eyes. "He's magnificent." The visit that had been planned for 3 days extended to a week, then 2. Eleanor Darby, who had never so much as boiled water in her own kitchen, found herself learning to bake bread alongside her daughter. She listened with genuine interest as Ethan explained the operation of the ranch, and even ventured out to watch the cowboys working with the winter herd. "I never understood," she confessed to Catherine on Christmas Eve as they sat by the fire, Henry sleeping peacefully in his grandmother's arms. "Why you would choose this life over everything your father and I wanted for you." Catherine looked around the cabin, decorated with pine boughs and handmade ornaments, at Ethan dozing in his chair after a long day's work at the life they had built together. "It's real," she said simply. "Every day has purpose, every achievement is earned, and the love." She met her mother's gaze. "The love isn't contingent on maintaining appearances or advancing family interests, it just is." Eleanor considered this, absently stroking Henry's downy head. "Your father and I married for all the proper reasons," she said quietly. "Position, compatibility of family interests, mutual respect. Love came later in its way, but never like what you and Ethan share," she sighed. "Perhaps we were wrong to expect you to follow the same path." "You wanted security for me," Catherine acknowledged. "I understand that better now with Henry. We want to protect those we love." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, "but protection can become a cage if we're not careful." She looked down at her grandson. "I won't make the same mistakes with him. Or with you if you'll allow me to be part of your lives." "I'd like that," Catherine said, reaching out to squeeze her mother's hand. "Very much." When Eleanor finally departed in early January, continuing her journey to St. Louis, the farewell was emotional but hopeful. She promised to return in the spring, perhaps to stay for a longer period if they were amenable. As winter gradually released its grip on the prairie, the Dawson Ranch thrived. The additional land proved to be everything Henry Darby had promised, allowing Ethan to diversify their operation with crops as well as cattle. They hired a young woman from town to help with household duties as Catherine divided her attention between her growing son and the demands of ranch life. By Henry's first birthday, The modest cabin had been expanded to include 2 additional rooms and a proper kitchen. The trust established by Catherine's father provided financial security they had never expected, though they remained committed to building their future primarily through their own efforts. Elinor visited as promised, bringing gifts and stories and a warmth that had been largely absent from Catherine's childhood relationship with her mother. Benjamin came once briefly, his relationship with his sister slowly mending through regular correspondence. On a golden afternoon in late October, as Henry took his first tentative steps across the cabin floor, Catherine found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The snowstorm that had seemed like the end of everything had actually been the first step on a path she could never have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan asked, coming to stand beside her as they watched their son's determined progress. "About that night," Catherine replied, "the blizzard, how close I came to never finding you." Ethan pulled her into his arms, resting his chin on top of her head. "I like to think we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be." Catherine smiled, turning in his embrace to face him. "Like us? Exactly like us," Ethan agreed, lowering his lips to hers in a kiss that still held all the promise of their beginning. Outside, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, gentle and glittering in the afternoon sun. But inside, surrounded by the family they had built together, Catherine and Ethan found only warmth and the certainty that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together. 5 years later, the Dawson Ranch had grown into one of the most prosperous operations in the county. The original cabin, now expanded into a comfortable farmhouse, stood at the center of a thriving enterprise that included cattle, crops, and a small apple orchard that Catherine had insisted on planting despite Ethan's initial skepticism. Henry, now 6 and the spitting image of his father, had been joined by 3-year-old twins Sarah Elinor and James Benjamin, whose arrival had turned their already full life into a joyful chaos that neither Catherine nor Ethan would trade for anything. On the anniversary of the blizzard that had brought them together, they had established a tradition of a special dinner, just the 2 of them, after the children were asleep. It was a time to reflect on their journey, to express gratitude for the life they had built, and to renew the promises they had made to each other. As Catherine placed candles on the table, and Ethan uncorked a bottle of wine he had been saving for the occasion, they shared a look of profound understanding. The path hadn't always been easy. There had been droughts and floods, injuries and illnesses, disagreements and reconciliations, but they had faced each challenge together, emerging stronger for having weathered the storms. "To us," Ethan proposed, raising his glass once they were seated. "To us," Catherine echoed, her eyes reflecting the candlelight and a love that had only deepened with time. "And to snowstorms that change lives." Outside, the prairie stretched vast and peaceful under a blanket of stars. The gate where Catherine had once collapsed, now part of an expanded entrance to their property. The woman who had once shivered at that gate, desperate and alone, had found not just shelter but a home, not just safety but love. And in that love, Catherine Darby Dawson had discovered the truth she had always sought, that the greatest adventures weren't found in distant lands or grand estates, but in the daily courage to build a life of one's own choosing, with someone who saw you clearly and loved you completely. That, she knew as she reached for her husband's hand across the table, was worth braving any storm.